November 9th, 2016 meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission, and begin with approval of the minutes. And before I actually go into that, Sandra Collins is our Ann Peterson tonight, and she would appreciate it if you would say your name when you're talking for a while, or at least I will, so that she can get you in the minutes and appropriately. So I just, if you don't do it, I'll remember to. Okay, do I hear any additions, deletions, corrections to the minutes of October 26th?
I move acceptance.
Your second? Second? Okay. Joel moved and Dennis seconded, excuse me. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? Okay. Minutes approved. Is there any correspondence from staff?
None from staff.
Any correspondence from anybody else? Okay. We're all the way to item 4, the Transportation Commission meeting report, which Joel Hamilton will give us an update on.
Given that I've been out of town for a month, and our meeting, which was originally scheduled for tomorrow, has been canceled for various reasons. No further report.
We're looking at December, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. So no report there. All right, we've come to item 5 on our agenda, which is the open microphone time, and it's an opportunity for members of the public to speak to the commission regarding matters that aren't on our agenda tonight, or currently pending before planning and zoning. Is there anyone who would like to speak about anything that's not related to our agenda? Okay, that opportunity is out there for those of you who may be listening at home, from home. All right, so now we go to item 6, which is the multimodal transportation plan presentation, and Mike's going to do, I guess he's not, Les McDonald's going to do the presentation. I thought you were going to do something first. Our Public Works Director. Thank you, Les. We really appreciate you coming. We are using this as an educational opportunity for the commission because we very often make zoning decisions. We not so often make planning decisions, and it's an important part of our education as people who are in charge of looking at the community from those lenses. And so we want to understand our transportation plan more, better, and the parts of the comprehensive plan that relate directly to it. So we appreciate you coming.
Oh, great. It's my pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation. So it's always good to talk about transportation when you're in the public works part of the world. So. Okay, so I am going to get us started here. Best to do this. Mike?
Yeah.
Just technical. Get it in there. Okay, I'll just stand out here for a minute, and Mike's going to work it out. So the multimodal plan is this big document right here. This is hopefully something you've all had a chance to see. Maybe you've had a chance to read into it a little bit. This is essentially a transportation planning document, but it's meant to address all modes of transportation within the city of Moscow, and to a certain extent within our small region around us. This plan originated through a request from the Idaho Transportation Department, really a suggestion with lots of emphasis, that the city really should have a transportation plan, because up until this time we did not have an official transportation plan. We had portions of our comprehensive land use plan that addressed mobility, and so just a chapter within the land use plan that you're all familiar with. So we would always cite that, and we would cite sidewalk program maps that we had, and different things that we were doing as a city when it would come to applications for grants and any kind of interaction with the state on those types of matters. They said, it's reaching the point that the city should have a plan, and guess what, we'll even help you fund it. So we applied for the funding, we got that funding, and ultimately resulted in this plan that addresses a lot of different issues, and we'll talk about that tonight. Those of you that have delved into this will understand that this is a very detailed plan in respect to transportation. It has many, many, many components within it, and way too many details to try to address tonight in this session. So what I have for you tonight is an overview that in some respects may be longer than it should be tonight, but just to give you just a kind of a general picture of what's in the plan and what all the different components are within the different chapters, it's a pretty extensive presentation. So I'm guessing I'll probably be about an hour going through it. We'll see how it progresses. Okay. And one of those things, if you have questions along the way, please feel free to jump in, but recognizing that I'm trying to give a general overview of the whole thing. So if we delve too far down one part or down one piece of it, we may get lost in the weeds and never come back. So.
Just as a opener, give us a sense of cities our size. Are they liable to have such a comprehensive plan, or how does it fit into the scale of things, the Twin Falls and the standpoints of Idaho? Would people have, this may be the first one that I've tried to tote around
Sure.
Here in Moscow. So I was just wondering how you put that in perspective.
Yeah, I suspect that most communities our size have a plan of some sort. If you're on the Washington side of the line, for instance, you have to adopt a 6-year transportation improvement plan, a TIP, as a city. And that's used as part of your funding applications with grant programs and state funding. So those cities in that state, pretty much all of them, have to have some kind of a basic plan that says what they're going to do for capital in that next 6-year horizon. This plan, really due to the nature of our community, is probably more extensive than most that you would find in a community our size. And it's really because we are large into the multimodal aspects. I mean, we like bike facilities, we like pedestrian facilities, we like transit, and we really try to build those things and make sure that those modes are appropriately dressed in the entire system. So the plan spends a lot of time in that area. I think a lot of communities our size, that's not necessarily the case. So that if they have a plan, it's probably quite a bit smaller. Okay, you're welcome. Thank you, Mike, for helping with that, and Zach. Okay, so an overview of the overall plan. So there are 8 chapters within the plan, so just to give you an idea of the types of things that are in here. Obviously an intro at the beginning, pretty typical. Getting around Moscow today kind of talks about what are the existing facilities as they are out there. Land use impacts on mobility, so how do we interrelate the comprehensive land use plan with the transportation plan. Roadway and traffic operations strategy, so how are we going to deal with roads and vehicular traffic. Active transportation strategies really has to do with the biking and pedestrian type modes. Transit, pretty self-explanatory. Parking and transportation demand management strategy, this really has to do with how we deal with parking in the downtown core and a little bit about some alternatives to manage the amount of vehicular traffic that happens. That's the TDM, transportation demand management portion. And then the action manual is really the wrap-up that says, okay, here's all the things we want to go do, and includes the recommendations on projects and programs and all those kind of things. We're going to walk through all of these, but just to give you an idea of what these chapters are. There are also 5 appendices. The first of those, the Transportation Fact Book, is just that, a book full of facts that says, here's what Moscow is, here's what it has. It has a transit system, it has a road system, et cetera, et cetera. Population information, demographics information, a lot of different things in the fact book in Appendix A. The Active Transportation Toolkit is something that's actually referenced within the body of the document, and it provides a lot of information about what types of facilities could you install or build that would promote active transportation, bicycle, pedestrian in particular. The Community Outreach Summary is a summary of all the actions that occurred through the development of the plan to reach out to the public and say, hey, this is what's going on, we're trying to write a plan, come talk to us. And there's a pretty robust amount of public outreach that happened with the development of the plan. Community Transportation Survey Summary and the Transit Survey and Ride Check Summary. These are documents that really describe some surveys that occurred. The Community Transportation Survey was an online survey that was available through the website. for this particular project, and you could go on for a period of, I think it was about 4 months in 2012, take this survey answering all kinds of questions related to transportation within the city of Moscow. So that Appendix D summarizes that survey and the responses we received. And then E is the transit survey. This was actually an on-the-bus survey. So we set it up so people know it was coming, and we had people for 4 days ride the bus system all the way around town. Everybody they could, they would hand them a survey form and say, here, please fill this out, and if you can, complete it while you're here on the bus. If not, take it home. Here's a self-addressed stamped envelope. You can mail it back to us, or here's a link to a website. You can finish it online. So that section includes the summary of the information that was garnered through that survey. Pretty good responses on those. On the transit survey on board, we had 60% response for those that we were trying to, ask for survey information. That's just crazy high. So it's, it was a good effort, and I think part of it was that it was a bit of a captive audience, right? You're on the bus, somebody's standing in front of you saying, hey, can you fill this out while you're sitting here? You're doing nothing. Come on, let's get it done. So people did. So that's a good thing. All right. Chapter 1, the intro, setting the context. Chapter 1 deals with a couple aspects in terms of how you're going to develop a plan. So it starts really with these guiding principles and objectives. What is it we're trying to do in the end product, and how are we going to get there? So it starts talking about mobility and access. These are kind of the principles that we want to uphold, I guess, throughout the document. We want the populace to be able to access all the destinations within the community to which they would like to go. We want to provide a diversity of travel options, so many different ways that you can get from point A to point B by mode and also by route. So whether you're going to ride or walk or take a bus, whichever it is, which route you want to take to get there. Provide some kind of a seamless multimodal connection. So if you're walking down the sidewalk system, you get to the bus stop, you hop on the bus, you get to downtown, you take some other form. So that was part of the goal. And then really we wanted to make the system usable for all users, all ages, all modes, all types. And that's, it's 2 words, all users, but it's a pretty broad scope when you think about it. All ages, all abilities, all modes. Well, everybody in town, right? Every visitor in town. So the idea here is that we want to have a transportation system that serves everybody in a multitude of ways so they can pick whatever works best for them in their particular situation. The next item, and before I jump into it, I'm going to tell you that there's going to be a little bit of a test at the end on this first list here of 1, 2, 3, and I think there's 7 of them all together. You're going to want to remember these because you will see them again later. So Downtown University Public Spaces, this was the next title, and really what they were looking at is let's identify community places throughout Moscow, places that people are going to want to go, spend time. We want those areas and places leading up to it to be walkable, interesting, safe, comfortable to use, safe from the perspective of, can you get there without hurting yourself or tripping over things or putting yourself in a situation where you feel uncomfortable with what's going on around you, so good lighting, all those kind of things. We want the transportation system to encourage people to stay, shop, eat, and play. So if you're taking the transportation system to an area within the community, we want it to be such that you're comfortable being there and you're thinking, hey, this is a good opportunity for me where I can come down and I can, if I'm downtown, I can do a little shopping, I can stay and eat. If I'm heading out to a sport facility or something like that, I can comfortably get there, I can go spend some time, I can play. And then recognition that, we've become a car-centric community, or country, I should say. Moscow does a little better than most when it comes to alternatives to driving your car. But we wanted it to be one of the principles in the early part of development of the plan that, let's look for alternatives to driving your car. Because that's important in a lot of different ways, traffic management, parking demands, impacts on the environment, general safety for pedestrians, bicyclists, all those things come into play. So that was part of that principle number 2. And this applies, in downtown, but also on university. A lot of the similar aspects between the commercial core and what happens in a highly populated university campus. Third guiding principle is economic resilience, and obviously that's something that the comprehensive land use plan addresses a lot. We want to make sure we're building a community that's going to remain strong over time. So looking for that sustained economic activity potential. Well, obviously a good transportation system helps support sustained economic activity. We also look to the issue of transportation costs. If you can keep costs down, it makes it easier for businesses to continue to grow and function. This is the part that was referenced earlier. How does the land use plan fit in with the transportation plan? Well, it's specifically here as a principle. We want to make sure we have well-designed streets, that we manage growth in a way that supports all the tenets and principles that we're addressing here. We include trails because that's part of that quality of life aspect. We want it to be a walkable, well-connected community. And there are a lot of pieces to that to make sure it all fits together. It all kind of wraps back into that quality of life and making sure that as we're doing land use decisions for urban density, that we're then supporting that density with the types of transportation mechanisms that are necessary to allow people to live in that manner and have a good quality of life in their place of choice. Safe streets, applying to everybody. We want to make sure that all modes have safe use of the street system in whatever form it may be. Part of that includes providing choices. So if you are riding your bicycle, maybe you're not comfortable riding on Mountain View, but if you move one street corridor to the west and you're riding up and down Cleveland, speeds are lower, volumes are lower, it's just more comfortable. So making sure people have a choice as to where they want to ride their bike in that particular instance. The Complete Streets model is one of the things that's suggested within the plan. And the Complete Streets is something that actually Transportation Commission is working on right now in the development of a proposed draft Complete Streets policy that would perhaps go on to the City Council for adoption. The Complete Streets model essentially says, again, all ages, all modes will be addressed in the transportation network. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that every single street has all modes on it, but as a network, you're addressing them all. And it also goes on to say anything that you are doing as you're developing the planning for and the funding for and the design for the transportation network, consider all modes, all ages, all abilities. So that's kind of the general thought of a Complete Streets policy. As a city, we typically do that. When you look at our street standards and the way we have planned for road extensions and bicycle networks and sidewalk programs and all those kind of things, we do most of the tenets of a Complete Streets model, but we don't have an official policy in place. So that's something transportation may very well carry forward to the City Council. And I'll mention that our Chair of Transportation, Ben Calabretta, is here this evening as well.
Does that mean existing streets should put in sidewalks
That potentially could be one outcome.
in the policy?
Well, there's no policy within this. It talks about, when you get to the street network, it talks about the desire for connectivity, which would address areas that perhaps don't have sidewalks today. And the city has worked on that, and part of what we do in looking at safe routes to school and transit access to transit routes by filling in some of those gaps. So it's a very large undertaking if you try to build sidewalks where they don't exist today. So you have to do it on a somewhat selective basis. Okay. Enhanced lighting, again, just more of a general safety. Lighting helps people see, particularly vehicle drivers, see pedestrians and bicycles, and just helps a general, safe feel for the modes. Active and healthy living. This is something that you may not normally see in a transportation plan because it isn't necessarily about getting from point A to point B, but it's more about how you get from point A to point B and what are the benefits of that method that you choose. So it proposes that we work towards programs that will help folks maintain that active lifestyle. support the walking to the transit. I mentioned that just a moment ago. Making sure that there are corridors so people have a sidewalk to get them to the transit system, then take them across town. Bikeways and bike parking. Here we're looking for how can we encourage folks to ride their bicycle, which then takes vehicles off the street and decreases downtown or commercial business district parking demands. It helps the overall air quality, all those kind of things, but it's also a method of keeping your health up, right, of maintaining that healthy living aspect. And, of course, improve walking routes along with that. So this section really talks about primarily walking and biking modes and how they are beneficial to some extent outside of the transportation arena, but also those modes tend to help other areas of the transportation arena. And number 7, environmental quality, and this fits in a little bit with the last section, but it's not just supporting the health of the individuals, but supporting the health of the environment. Again, as I mentioned earlier, reducing vehicle emissions, those types of things, congestion problems, which certainly helps air quality and the overall environmental condition. So remember those 7 for later. Okay. The chapter 1 then goes on into the planning process. How are we going to do this? How are we going to develop a plan from scratch, get input from all the community, and do all the various things? So really it breaks it down. It says we want to define the issues that are out there, figure out what they all are, what are the concerns within the city of Moscow, then work towards developing the policy and the programs and the project options, what could it all look like, and then actually write the multimodal plan. That seems simple enough, right? So they broke this into several pieces, starting with the look back at the chapters. So this setting the context, and this actually branches into the organization of the plan itself. Setting the context, you may have seen that on that first chapter page when I threw it up there for chapter 1. They broke the document really into 3 sections, if you will. The first 3 chapters are this setting the context idea. So they're really looking at what's going on in Moscow. What's the current transportation network like, and how does land activity, development, and use interact with that transportation system? So chapters 1, 2, and 3 are all within that setting the context component. The second component is the establishment of multimodal strategies. How are we going to address the different modes? What are we going to do? How best to get there? So each of these chapters kind of address different sections. Of course, number 4 there really is dealing with the street itself and traffic and vehicular load and freight, those types of things. The active transportation in 5 is that pedestrian bicycle component we were just talking about. Transit, again, in number 6, and then the parking and the TDM strategy in number 7. And then the final component of the plan organization is how do we implement? So again, chapter 8, the action manual itself. So that takes us on to chapter 2, which is still part of the setting the context. I'm referencing that little line right up there. In this case, getting around Moscow, what's out there today. So it begins really with looking at, what do we have? What's our population? What's the geography like? What's the topography like? The terrain, those various things that impact transportation. It identifies activity centers and what is the character of the land use as defined through current use, but also defined by the Comprehensive Land Use Plan. Comments particularly on schools and different commercial districts downtown and in the outlying areas, addresses single-family, multifamily housing, a lot of those things that would be in the land use plan as well. There are maps like these, and some of these are going to be a little hard to see because they're pretty large to fit, but in general what this is showing is the city proper, university over here, the downtown kind of in this yellow area here, this green line around, the blue line around over here, those are the east and west transit routes as they exist at the time the plan was written. And then you'll see little things like this, where these are the schools, and then you've got like some of the senior facilities and commercial areas, those types of things. So they're really trying to identify those activity centers to say, all right, these are the places people want to go. How do we get them there? Right? So you got to know that before you can start developing the plans to improve the system. They looked at what they called a mobility profile, which is essentially is just that assessment of how do people get around now? How many people ride? How many people walk? That type of thing. So they developed this type of a chart. So in this case, means of transportation to work, Moscow, Lewiston, Pullman, Latah County, so different areas. So how do you get to work? So this is the commute versus the recreational mode. I drive by myself. If I'm in Moscow, 57.6% of people commuting to work are solo passengers in a vehicle. Okay? As compared to Lewiston, which is 82%, quite a bit higher. So that's where some of that distinction between Moscow and other communities starts to show. Pullman is actually a little bit lower. They have a very, very robust bus system in Pullman. That's part of it. Latah County is a little higher than the city, and then the state, of course, is higher than the city as well. So you can see the others, people that have carpooled, if they've taken the transit system, you can see Pullman, 8.8% transit. That's huge, right? For Moscow, this is our monster right here, 19.6% of people walk to work in Moscow. That's tremendous. The other one that goes with that is riding bicycles, almost 6%. Again, that's a tremendous mode share across the country. You don't see that in very many communities. So it's something we can be proud of. We've got a good system. It can be better, and we're working on that. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And some folks work at home. So this kind of information is within the plan. There's different charts like this. There's just one example to give you an idea of kind of the data that they were gathering in the process. Walking and bicycling in Moscow, this is a long list, but when it talks about these modes, there are lots of things that come into play. Are the streets designed for cars? Do we have lots of hills? Are highways difficult to cross? Are there places where you can tie into the trail system? Is there delay downtown when you're walking downtown along the highways because you're waiting for signals or you're waiting for gaps in traffic? Are bicyclists behaving themselves? Not always, but okay, that's something that happens. Are we maintaining our sidewalk system and our bikeway systems well? All these things have impacts, but it was kind of a snapshot of what's going on in those modes and what are the issues that exist within the city of Moscow. Transit, this one's probably a little simpler. It's, they're simply, hey, you got a fixed route system. It's got 2 routes. It runs on half-hour run. It has no cost. It runs from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. Here you go. We also have a dial-a-ride service. That's an on-call system that is out there. So a little easier on the transit side, but they did provide or gather information on transit and how it operates. So here, this is a comparison of the system effectiveness with SMART, which of course it is called today, and other systems that are out there. So here's the SMART column versus other similar type systems, and then the percentage comparison. So they looked at things like, what's the population? Well, we're 24,000 at the time. Average system out there is like 67. We're a small community for transit. That's part of the difference there. So we're only running about 36% of the average. How many trips do we see? Available vehicles, how big are we compared to others? What kind of expenses do we see? Obviously, in a smaller system, you tend to see higher prices, those types of things. So that's the kind of information they gathered on the transit system itself. Again, you're trying to get a picture of what exists. They did identify that there are probably some transit service needs, both existing and that will continue to come to the forefront as we grow, both in population and footprint, but also in just ridership. So there are impacts associated with that. There are a number of exhibits like this, maps in the system. Again, where they're looking kind of at the demographics of the users of the transit system. In this case, these are carless households for that 4 or 5 year period. How many people per acre, households per acre, have cars or do not have cars? And you do this kind of mapping because it helps you understand where transit service might be beneficial because people don't have cars. So transit is a very viable alternative for them if it comes by their neighborhood. So this type of mapping, there's also income-based mapping and I think some age mapping and different versions that are in there. As one would expect, a lot of this is probably university related, just like you see down here. You know, where the students live, they may not bring a car to class, riding the bus is a great option. Roadway and traffic operations, really, how does it work? How does the system work? How are people driving? What kind of cars do you see? Where do you see them? Those types of things. You see maps like this that are looking at a proportion of single occupancy vehicle commuters. So remember we had what, 50-odd% of people driving by themselves to work. Well, this gives you a graphic in terms of where they come from within the community. So you see a lot, higher percentage out in these outlying areas driving themselves in. Whereas you get closer into town, believe it or not, there are actually lower percentages of people running single occupancy. Nelson.
Do we have any comfort that this transit system will be here for a few years? Are we pretty positive about that?
Well, it's in its 12th year. It launched in the spring of 2004. And we're still at it. It's had its rocky moments along the way in terms of, who runs it and who owns it and how we finance it. But the program seems to continue on, and we hope to keep it going. So is there any guarantee? No. And part of that is because we're relying upon outside funding. There's federal dollars that pay for the operations of the system. We don't have fare box, and there's a lot of debate about fare box revenues and whether they actually pay for themselves or not. And so we are very reliant upon federal dollars and then a certain amount of local dollars from the city and from some of the commercial entities, university, here within the city. The local funding is not enough to run the program. So as long as the federal dollars continue, in theory, we should be able to continue the system. Also in the roadway traffic operations, they looked at general volumes, what are the street capacities, how well are they performing, what's the safety, we got crash history kind of information that's considered. They gather information like this, so here are reported collisions that occurred in that 5-year span. Each year here, what's the severity of the accident, was it property damage, minor injuries, moderate, severe, fatalities, we did have one down there. And how many per year. So again, they're just trying to get a snapshot of the characteristics of the system, in this case, how safe the system is as it operates. Intersection operation, level of service, that's a pretty standard measure for how an intersection performs. The level of service, or the LOS, is generally based upon delay. How long do you sit there waiting for the signal or waiting to get through a signal? Do you have to go through multiple cycles? Are you at an intersection that does not have a signal? You're on a side street, Steiner and State Highway 8, for instance, where you're sitting on the side waiting for a gap in the highway traffic on a 5-lane roadway that never seems to come. That delay gets longer and longer, the level of service goes down. And they looked at a bunch of intersections around the community. Freight mobility, not a large part. We don't have a huge freight component, and it's typically, either pass through on the highway system or local delivery in the freight side. Parking, primarily they looked at downtown. They didn't really get into parking in the outlying areas. Downtown was kind of the one area that seemed to have a concentrated parking need and in some folks' mind a concern. So they looked at the existing lots at the time, how many spaces they were, what was the utilization based upon the permits that were issued, and then just all permit or all use within the system. You can see here there's capacity at that time in terms of the utilization. Obviously depends on the day and time of day, that type of thing. They looked at systems that we might have in place to help deal with demand. So things like the Moscow van pool, where you get a group of folks that live in Lewiston and they drive to Moscow to work, and so 6 or 8 or 10 of them all get together and they work with the city for the city's van pool. That just cuts down the vehicle miles traveled and the pollutant load and parking demand, all of that. Obviously smart, having a transit system, programs like Bike for Life and Safe Routes to School, which is now called the Transportation Alternatives Program, TAP. And then, of course, the university, they identified have some programs as well. They've got their own shuttle. They've got a couple of zip cars and then a Zimride online ride-sharing type program. That takes us out of that snapshot and takes us now into Chapter 3, which is the land use component, perhaps more interest to the group here. It really looked at where are we from the demographics perspective and where are we going. So what is the population growth that's anticipated at that time? They were looking at a 32% projected growth by the time we hit 2030, population of just shy of 32,000 people, and anticipated that 50% of that would be students, that growth. And that was, of course, based on the proposals from the university leadership that, hey, we're going to grow this university to some particular student population. Now, whether that pans out, of course, we'll see. They look at employment trends, what's been happening, charts like this where they looked at a 12-year period, the fun times, of course, there after 05. Future land use, so again, the land use plan, what are we anticipating is going to happen? And this information that they're looking at is really based on the comprehensive land use plan. And then this is the comprehensive sanitary sewer system plan, which seems like a really odd thing. But they gathered a lot of this data from the CSSP, which in turn used the comprehensive land use plan and the good services of Bill Belknap, our community development director, to help create the projections of population growth. So they all kind of work together. Out of that, they're really looking to maintain the principles that are within the comprehensive land use plan, doing things like maintaining the neighborhood identity, providing that mix of housing for all the different folks within the community, anticipating, expanding that downtown area, something that is occurring. And then there's just a continuum of land use. People are using land in a certain way today. You presume they're going to continue to do that and allowing them to continue to do that, in this case, through the transportation network, rather than just the land use and zoning components. They also looked at future growth. This is a map you may have seen before that shows the footprint of the city of Moscow dating clear back to 1891 in that upper left corner, a little hard to see, all the way through 2009, and then what is anticipated the future land growth area. Not the same scale, so we're not growing by 6 times, but it is a little bigger than this one. So the components that are within that, of course, looking specifically at downtown, what are you going to see for urban growth in that area? What happens in the urban renewal areas, Legacy Crossing, of course, being the current one. What happens in that potential southeast industrial corridor, and then other specific target areas that are within the plan. This is one of the graphs that came out of there. This is a comparison of the base and future year assumptions as it relates to population. What are we seeing in 2012? What's that growth projection? 37%, as I mentioned, up to 35,000 people. That came out of this case, the sewer master plan. What do you expect for jobs, U of I enrollment, non-auto mode splits, pedestrian, bicycle, transit, right? And then some of the regional things, people coming from outside of Moscow, people leaving Moscow, people passing through Moscow. What kind of numbers in 2012? What kind of numbers, essentially 20 odd years out? And the changes that you'd expect. See that in 1%? That's pretty conservative. If we're going to do a lot of the things that are in the plan, we want to increase the mode share for bikes and pedestrians, that one's pretty low. The others, 40% citywide jobs, well, we'll see, But they had to come up with something, and again, this is based on the best data they had available at the time, looking at the history, looking at the projections from the various documents and folks that they spoke with about where we're heading. Another one here is this is looking at the gateway traffic. So each of the highways, west side, east side, north and south. What were we in 2012? What's the projection and the amount of growth then occurring in that time frame? So you see over there on the right, they're ranging anywhere from 9% growth up to 21% based on history. Sometimes history is the best thing we have in predicting where we're going in the future. It'll vary some, but we find in Moscow we tend to trend pretty consistently over time, through the decades, if you will. Planned transportation improvements. These are really a list of things that were on the books already at the time related to what was going on, and this is not really the capital program, but in Chapter 3 they include these, just saying, hey, here's some things that are in that 2013 to 2020 time frame. Some of these, the sidewalk path on D Street, that's in front of the middle school. That's done. ADA ramps on 95 and State 8. Well, we've done, I don't know, 25 of them, something like that. There's more to come. Sidewalks on North Polk Street, that was finished this year. We're actually looking to extend that work even further north to the North City limit through a grant application that was just submitted last week. Downtown streetscape is something that's in the works. Potentially will become part of an upcoming bond issue that may go out this coming spring. And then some other additional hot spots that were identified really through the Mobility Task Force, which was a subset of the Transportation Commission a few years ago, that looked at problem areas for accessibility and mobility around the community. A lot of those hot spots have already been dealt with. We've already built the facilities or fixed the problems that were there. So a lot of these things have actually already happened, which is good progress, I think, overall. I also looked at some of the roadway improvements. A Street, Peterson to Home, that thing's been on the books forever. It is now slated and fully funded for construction starting in 2019. So the end is in sight. Mountain View Road, the 6th Street roundabout down to Joseph Street, that is a grant-funded project that currently does not have a construction year. It's out past 2020. And then the White Avenue to State 8 piece does not yet really have any funding. So projects that were in the overall plans, not all going to happen by 2020. Next chapter, and we're into the different section. This is the establishing the multimodal strategies beginning. Chapter 4, so this is the roadway and traffic, what's going on in streets and vehicles. This is where it starts talking about road connectivity. Is the road network connected that allows people in their vehicle to get from one part of town to the other part of town without doing major reroutes and detours and all those kind of things? They looked at different quadrants and this is just kind of a general summary of what's in there. I mean, obviously that there's quite a bit that talks about these areas. Northwest quadrant, one of the big issues they said is that there's really no connection between US 95 and State Highway 8 in the form of an arterial. Someday that will be Rodeo Drive extension around to Farm Road. So long term, there's a plan for it, but it doesn't exist today. Southwest quadrant, same kind of a situation, no arterial route really around the southwest part of town. People cut through the university, which is not great. And in the same respect, the university actually limits connections because of the land use there that really prohibits arterial road construction. Southeast quadrant, their comment here really was that, well, there's been limited development out there. I think primarily they're thinking, south of the highway, south of East Side Marketplace, a lot of really big parcels. There's room for connectivity to occur as that property develops. Northeast quadrant.
What streets are we talking about? Because 95 does connect to the Pullman Highway.
95 and State 8 connect, but a connection between those up in the northwest quadrant of the city. So if you were, the plan ultimately is where Rodeo intersects US 95 on the north end, will swing westerly and then south and tie in at Farm Road by the Palouse Mall. That would be an arterial route connecting those two highway systems in the northwest quadrant of the community. And the idea here is that you're providing an alternative route, so not all the traffic has to go through the downtown core, but that's what we're lacking.
An alternative connection.
Yes.
Needed.
Yes, because we don't have that alternative connection, so there's no choice really but to come down at least to A Street and go across, which has its issues right now, or come all the way down to State 8 and go across. And when you're limited to those kind of choices, then congestion becomes a problem, all those kind of things. Okay? All right. Those three quadrants, the northeast quadrant said, generally east-west is not bad in the northeast with the exception of 3rd Street. Obviously, 3rd Street doesn't go through, as you know. They do talk about Mountain View being the primary north-south route, but it's really the only one on the east half of the city. So they suggested that an additional north-south route, probably a little further east, would be beneficial. And one of the things they point out as well, among others, is that the lack of connectivity does promote use of local streets. So if you don't have enough routes to take you through, then you start driving, A Street and 1st Street and take your pick, right?
That's a local street versus a
Yes.
non-local street.
yes, it's the, yeah, it forces people onto local street systems, which is not necessarily where you want them to be. Local class. Part of the philosophy that's in here is limit out of way travel, if I read it correctly. This is what I mentioned earlier. We want people to get from point A to point B in the most efficient manner and not have to make a lot of detours in the line of travel to get there. So you want to limit the out-of-way travel. Spread the traffic to multiple corridors that are intended to carry the traffic. We want to limit cut-through traffic on campus for reasons I think most people would understand. We want to ensure that there are adequate roads in all new development and future development. That's a role of planning and zoning, of course, as well as Transportation Commission. Reduce response time for emergency services. And that's something, again, beneficial to the life and health and safety of our citizens here. And the road system certainly has a big role in that. They suggest some road connectivity projects in this chapter, and this is just pulled right out of the plan. I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can see what some of them are. There's the A Street, Farm Road to Warbonnet. That's an extension. That Farm Road, which I was talking about, coming around over to Mix, which would eventually tie into Rodeo. I was just describing a minute ago. Things like that. So these are primarily, I mean, these are essentially at least collector, if not minor arterial class streets.
Wes, I don't know whether I was going to wait till the end to ask a question about this, but maybe I'll ask it now since we're here. So when you see in the plan that's associated with this connection, are those right-of-ways secured?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
A lot of those are just planned corridors, and in a few cases there may be some right-of-way, but generally speaking it's, hey, this is an area that we need to make sure that right-of-way is obtained through the development process so that those roads can be extended as appropriate to support, the transportation network and the land use.
Because that impacts us because we're approving subdivisions that might put a house right in the middle of one of those connections. That's
Exactly. Very good. Very good. So yes, that's what those maps are intended to do, is inform everyone of the need to help preserve those corridors for those purposes.
Our thoroughfare plan reflects a lot of those alignments. It's just that we have this more recent multimodal transportation plan. So that'll be kind of the next step, is when we go through an updated comp plan, is make it correspond to what the multimodal transportation plan is.
So this is one of the maps that's there. This happens to be the future roadway connection. So those ones that are on the list are the ones that you're going to see here. You'll notice most of them around outlying areas of the city, a little bit down here. And the idea being just that, as development occurs around the fringes, which is where we see the greatest change and also the greatest potential to either create a traffic problem or help continue a good traffic system, we want to make sure that we know that those corridors are the ones that we need to preserve. That's that Rodeo Mix Road to Farm Road one we were just talking about, Baker Extension, A Street Extension, to the west. So really, like I say, this is intended to just help show that, hey, these are areas where if land action is happening, make sure you take into consideration the need for the transportation network. Nils.
I want to just back off to the land use discussion. I didn't know if this firm predicted where growth might be. In other words,
Well, it shows on one of the maps.
like on this map, you see some dotted lines that indicate something could be happening there, but do we make a prediction that growth is sort of continuing out in the east, in the northeast direction, or is it possible in other directions? Or there could be some kind of a coloring here about predicting if we could.
Well, it's in
Where
chapter
three.
2. Yeah, it's in chapter 2 on page 39 of the document that we had, and it shows light yellow, low density residential practically.
So we passed it.
Well, I didn't show it, but there's a lot of maps in this document, so I just had a select few. But yes, there is a map that's based upon what is in the land use plan and what's in the comprehensive sewer system plan, and the discussions that the consultant had with the community development department that shows what is anticipated for growth in the different regions around the city out into the future. Yeah, that's all there, and that helped inform this map, which then shows, okay, what's the road network that you need to serve that growth into the future. And I'll also tell you that a lot of these routes were also identified by the Transportation Commission back about almost a decade ago now, when we looked at how does the existing road network extend outward to what ultimately would be the ring road concept at that time. And so there was a lot of overlap of a lot of information that resulted in these corridors. But, okay. There is a section specifically on the 3rd Street Bridge, because this was an area that was a hot topic at the time, I guess, and part of the whole east-west connectivity. So they did devote some time to looking at the 3rd Street Bridge. Part of it is they identified, what issues are out there, either from their perspective or from the input received during all that public comment process. Some of those would be that 3rd Street, if the bridge was put through, could pick up additional volume from the B and 6th Street corridors, which is logical. People might shift to 3rd Street rather than staying on the others. That there are residential properties along the route, which again is the case for really all of our east-west corridors within the community. The proximity to Lena Whitmore was noted, as well as the adjacency of East City Park. Some of the things that were mentioned through the comment process, and they wanted to make sure they were noted within the document itself. They did an evaluation of alternatives for bridge across Paradise Creek at 3rd Street. 3 of them. The first, number 1, being a pedestrian and bicycle-only bridge that would not carry motor vehicles. Number 2 is a full-access multimodal bridge, so it would carry not only bicycles and pedestrians, but also motor vehicles, transit, whatever other types of vehicles would need to cross. And then that same bridge as option number 3, but with traffic calming along the 3rd Street corridor. And that one really came about because there were concerns expressed that if the multimodal bridge was put in and the traffic then shifted from B and D and 6th Street over to 3rd, then the volumes on 3rd Street might get to be excessive and detrimental to the neighborhood. So the traffic calming concept was, okay, let's back away a little bit of that traffic. If you use traffic calming techniques, it tends to slow the speed, which is always a concern around activity centers, but also at times tends to discourage people from using that route. So there's a balance in there. I mean, if you're opening it up, obviously you want people to use it, but you don't want it to get carried away, so then you restrict it a little bit through a traffic calming process. So that was the third option, and they modeled all the traffic that was anticipated throughout the system. They used the 2035 projections in their modeling, and in the end, the plan recommends alternative 3, which is the full access multimodal bridge with traffic calming.
Did Trace that all the way to downtown?
This map right here shows, is in the plan, it's figure 4.3. There's a couple of maps in there, I just pulled one, but this is the 2035 forecast. What it shows here at all these different black dot locations, okay, are what is either existing traffic volume, which is what's in gray, or the anticipated traffic volume, that's existing today, I should say, in gray at 2012, or in blue, yellow, and orange, the 3 alternatives. So the blue being alternative 1, pedestrian-only bridge over here, yellow being the vehicular bridge, and then the orange being vehicular bridge with traffic calming. So it's a little hard to read the numbers up there, but what you would see, for instance, let me just pick this one down here. If we did the pedestrian bridge only, 2035, it's anticipated you'd see 5,800 vehicles. So because really there's no change east of Hayes, if you will, or east of Blaine, because the bridge is not there for vehicles. So 5,800 if a ped-only bridge would jump maybe to 6,300 if a bridge alone, full access bridge was installed, and then drop back down to say 5,500, I think that says, with traffic calming to then offset some of that desired use. So they did that throughout the system, and that just gives you an idea of how it's all set up. You know, in some areas you would see increases. You know, obviously places like this where you're east of Hayes, you'd see the vehicle volumes go up if the bridge went through. Offsetting from that, you'd see decreases on the north-south of Hayes because people wouldn't have to turn on Hayes to continue on to Mountain View. So that's what these numbers would reflect.
How did they get those estimates? That's what.
The estimates are based upon the traffic volumes that were there at the time, the information that we had available from all the traffic counting data that the city accumulates every year in our normal annual traffic counting program. And then they did computer modeling simulation of the way traffic flows on a street network system. And this is something you can build in a model. They do it all the time. And it looks at the characteristics of the road system, what kind of volumes we have, ties all the growth projections into it, and the model ultimately says, okay, out of that we would anticipate that vehicles are going to flow here or they're going to flow there. And as you change the constrictions to flow, so things like traffic calming, then the model says people start choosing alternate routes, which is intended to reflect the reality that people will choose alternate routes. So that's generally how the modeling is done when it comes to traffic.
Well, it was confusing to those of us kind of looking at this, that in 2012, it said there were 8,000 cars on 3rd Street, and then on this model, it said 5,000 cars.
All depends on where you are on the street. There are different counts all the way along the corridor, so it kind of depends on which counts you're looking at what point in the corridor.
If you look at the map, I mean, that sounds good, but if you look at the map that you've given me, it looks like it's exactly at the same place. I mean, I don't think, in other words, I'm looking at 8368, and it's just, how can it go from 83 in 2000, well, that's 2008 and 2011, actually the same figures.
Different numbers, different
and then
years.
all of a sudden it's 5,000.
Different numbers, different years.
There's almost, you have to really work a little hard to explain that.
Well, again, there's
When you
multiple.
look across 3rd Street, you're going to have way less cars.
I'm just saying that I've got two maps, this map and one he gave me, and they both show two different figures, and I'm just asking why. Why would
Was
one be
it not at the
8,000?
same place though?
Same place, right here, on 3rd Street, just south of the high school. The map, I mean, I didn't invent it, he gave it to me at least a couple of times, and it says 83,000 or 8,300, so I'm just asking that question. It seems strange.
Yeah, it could be that it was a count a little bit further east, where they placed the dot maybe isn't the exact spot.
It's a pretty significant change.
Yeah, and as you continue continue east.
If 50 cars in their neighborhood are really upset, and I think it's not a quibbling number, about 3,000. I'm just a little dumbfounded.
As you continue east, the volume on 3rd Street decreases. As you continue east, on all these corridors, the volume decreases as you progress. So it depends on the point. And what really matters here is what's the change that occurs. That's what this was really trying to reflect, is what is the change, what's the impact of doing something in the system. Does the volume go up? Does the volume go down? Generally, what's the magnitude? Is the starting number 5,000? Is it 8,000? It is whatever it is, and it varies from year to year and block to block. Okay. So, yeah, I can't answer that one right now, Nels. But
Between 2008 and 2011, it didn't vary at all in the numbers that you've given. You can look at the map here. I mean, we can just look at it together. I mean, I'm just looking at it, and then 5 or 6 years later, when the traffic or Moscow population has certainly increased, now all of a sudden it's just dropped off 3,000. I find that to be.
Good.
So what is the source of what you're talking about?
What's that?
What is the other source besides this?
Urban
that
need,
you're quoting
traffic
from?
volumes. Les gave me this.
that's
With his
a
very
general.
hand right to
That
my
is.
hand. He's given me this, and I'm asking why these two figures are so different.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but I just want to.
No, I didn't
The rest of
make
the
a
segment.
map. I just took what he gave me.
That map was the latest edition of the publication of the map. It doesn't mean the counts came from that year. The counts come from a variety of different years. They're reflected as the latest count on whatever map is being produced at the time. Okay, so it doesn't mean that every count that's on that map was in 2008 or 2011. Right? They vary. Let me finish. They vary from year to year. They vary seasonally throughout the year. Not all the counts happen at the same time every year. So there's a lot of fluctuation within the system. Okay, so what I'm suggesting to you is don't get hung up on what the individual number is. Look at the change, because it's the impact up or down.
Well, I just wonder whether they after high school got out, and I mean, there's lots of pulses during the day.
This is a day, this is all day.
It's average day for a week,
What?
typically.
That's a day figure. We're not talking about an hour. So anyway, I don't want to go further with this. You can, but I'd like you to consider explaining that to me as we go down the pike.
Okay, the next area that the plan focused was the ring road concept, and this is one that has been around a long time. It was actually here when I got here 13 years ago, 2003, and Walter Steed was the chair of the Transportation Commission back then. He and Philip Cook were alternating back and forth.
It's affectionately known as the orbital distributor.
The orbital distributor was one of the popular alternative names. It has gained other names over the years, but it's a concept that's been around a long time. Essentially, if you're not familiar with it, it looks something like this. A little hard to see with this particular color, but the idea was to create a corridor future roadway system that would encircle the entire community. All right? The alignment is generally based upon topography. Where could you actually physically fit a road with the topography that we have? In some areas over here, we actually left the state of Idaho to make it work because there were a lot of things here like a university and commercial district and all that in the way, and a pretty good ridge up here on Warbonnet that kind of precluded a good, pass-through kind of corridor in there. So we ended up drifting into Washington. That was an interesting discussion with the state transportation departments, but they're on board. We looked at making sure we were far enough out that we stayed ahead of development in the planning and ultimately in right-of-way acquisition. As properties developed out there, you could take this corridor into account with new subdivisions and road needs, that type of thing. Then we, of course, worked on what happens for the road network extending out to it. I referenced that earlier, work by Transportation Commission. So this was the concept. This was around for a good decade before it really started to change. Some of that change came out of community input. Some of it came out of interactions with the county and their planning operations there, and some of it came out of this particular plan. So the idea here is, well, let's study this and see if indeed this will do what we think it will do, which is relieve a lot of the pressure for traffic congestion, truck traffic, left turn movements at 3rd and Washington, all that downtown, and try to improve that situation. So we asked the consultant to look at this, do assessment, kind of an outside third party, if you would, and let us know what they thought. So they've done that. Again, they used the 2035 population projections. What they found, again, using the modeling, was that the volumes on the system would vary anywhere from a low of 1,200 vehicles per day in that northeast quadrant, down all the way up to 6,500 per day on the south-south quadrant. I like that. That's probably the southwest quadrant with my fat thumb or something. Southwest typically is where you'd expect to see the greatest volume. There were reductions in the average daily traffic internal to the system. That's what this list is right here. So Washington Street, they anticipated that you'd see a decrease in 1,300 vehicles a day. Jackson, 3,500 vehicles a day. So there were some impacts. There were some benefits based on the modeling that the ring road would provide in terms of traffic volumes and, to a certain extent, congestion.
How did the firm respond to the, I thought this was a pretty far-reaching idea. I don't know, but I blame it on Walter sometimes. I don't know whether it's fair. Is that the creative idea of thinking of how this would work? But how did the firm, the planning firm, did they see it as a really interesting tool for predicting what might happen in
The,
idea of it, I
yeah,
guess.
they were very,
Started out in our comp plan a few years ago, and I was just trying to get a sense of how they responded to it. They
Now,
obviously-
if I may, it came from a study that was done on 3rd Street in Washington by ITD. Transportation, when they were formed in 1998, looked at a right-hand turn coming east on Highway 8 from WSU to turn south on Jackson. We wanted to have a way to turn right, to line up in the right-hand turn lane. The city council member said, you can't just do that. You have to have a study. So $60,000 later, we had a study. And the study with ITD funding said you can continue to put all this traffic through this intersection by City Hall for the next several decades. Now, you may have to strip parking off of 3rd. You may have to cut the sidewalks in half to widen it. You may have to take some property and buildings, but you can force it through them. And that was when transportation, and it may have actually come from Les's predecessor, who said, why don't we look at a ring road and see if there's a way to get it out of town. So that was the genesis of it. We worked or played or whatever you want to call it with this thing for a couple of years, trying to figure out, like Les says, topographically, where could you put it? We didn't really look at a lot of land ownership. We did try to hit some existing rights of way, but it was just a what if scenario.
Sure,
So,
well, I understand.
So backing one step back with all those new connector roads that are hypothetical right now, but they're on paper, it's kind of 1 degree less of a planning imprint, but it accomplishes a lot of the same goals of finding alternate east-west routes in particular around town. Did they do I forget when I was looking at the study, did they show the amount of decrease in traffic that would happen through the core of town if they...
so those numbers right there.
Yeah, okay, so that would be the same thing. So all those little, not going to Ring Road, but going to all those, okay.
Yeah.
And one last thing I'd like to say, Les has already used the word, it was a concept.
Sure.
It was never a plan.
No, I get it.
It was a concept of what might be possible when you can't force another vehicle through this intersection, with a bulldozer. It's got to go somewhere.
So I just presume that we think that, well, the concept of it, that idea of it, would follow some other road plan that would come in the future as we develop. We gave up subdividing land before we developed it. I don't know what year we stopped doing that, 1920 or 30 or something like that.
So I guess to try to answer your question, how did they respond to this? The ring road concepts are common around the country. Even Pullman has one at this point, and not everybody knows that. But yeah, it's a common technique as cities grow. You go down to places like Houston, you look at the highway system and the highway. They're just
awfully small, but then Washington seems to have profoundly more money than
certainly.
we do in Idaho.
But part of it is that recognizing that we had a real pinch point downtown. It's kind of the commercial core, and yet we're pushing every vehicle that comes through the city right through a 6 square block area. Is that a sustainable model in the long term? Probably not, was the thought. And so again, this was intended to look at how can we relieve the traffic issues downtown, provide potential alternative routes one side of town to the other, provide alternatives for truck traffic, for freight, those types of things. So they took a look at it, Rob.
But just coming back to this, because the one, maybe the elephant in the room is the cost, because when we were looking at Pullman Ring Road from 270 around to 195, the costs were like $1.5 billion, and they own a good portion of the right-of-way already. So these are really expensive propositions, and
Right
it's,
here.
yeah.
Okay, so just to carry on, because I think I'll answer most of these questions. The concept, what they found, based on their assessment, and they've seen these before, so they're used to them, was that they did not anticipate a significant impact on the local freight routing, because we just don't have that many trucks that would necessarily use the ring road if they're doing local deliveries. Okay? Now, you could have an effect on the chip trucks that are rolling from Sandpoint to Lewiston or wherever they go. They felt that the southwest quadrant would have the highest use, and part of that thinking is we laid that one out with the idea that it could become part of a west bypass, highway bypass of the city of Moscow, northwest and southwest. The southwest quadrant, based on a origin destination study done by ITD back in about 2004 or 5, indicated that quadrant would most likely see the highest usage because people are coming from either south or from the east and then wanting to go on to Pullman, and so that's the leg, that southwest quadrant, that if they had a corridor, they might use. These people, our consultant, agreed with that. So southwest quadrant, highest use. They felt, though, that based on these numbers, that it does not significantly improve the downtown intersectional level of service. Okay, it didn't really do that much for a price tag of roughly $110 to $140 million. So if you're not seeing a great benefit from it for that kind of cost, maybe it isn't something you pursue. What they did recommend was that we do consider pursuing the southwest quadrant, because that would be the one leg that would be the most beneficial in terms of the kind of volume. And again, if we go back to these numbers, that's 6,500 vehicles a day on the southwest quadrant, where you'd expect to see the benefit. So if we were going to do that, that southwest quadrant could divert the biggest piece of traffic out of the downtown of any of them. Could also potentially act as a connector between the highways that could also be part of a west bypass at some point in time.
It was always thought to be federal funding, not local.
Oh, yeah.
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 And it would involve interstate
Cooperation.
cooperation, yeah.
Certainly.
Les, I take it that the planning, either us or the firm, trying to find a solution for Third and Main and Jackson is just very difficult. I take it they couldn't think of a brilliant other answer.
We did not ask them to look at Third and Main and Jackson. We did not, because that location's already been studied. The study that Walter just referenced that said, yeah, take half the sidewalks, take all the parking, add lanes.
There goes all your other goals
You can
for
punch the
downtown.
traffic through. There you go. Now,
Yeah, give it up.
what Walter did not say about that study is at the time the city said, we don't think so. And so they actually modified the conclusion of the study that said, yes, you can do this, but we recognize as a community the city of Moscow does not find that as an acceptable alternative. And they are looking at a ring road concept, and they should explore that. That's where that study ended up. So yes, you could funnel all that traffic downtown, impacts on business, impacts on quality of life, impacts on our after-hours events that we put on Main Street, all those kind of things make that option one that probably is not real great for us. Thus the ring road. Okay. So this study, unfortunately, was not as supportive of that overall concept as I would have liked, but it did say, hey, look at the southwest and to some extent the northwest for the bypass concept. The city has, go ahead.
Were they looking at how much of that traffic that is a problem is truck traffic that is just going through?
They
As
didn't
opposed
break
to-
it down to that extent. The origin destination study that ITD did included that type of an assessment. So they had that information available from the ITD work. Since this came out, the Transportation Commission has taken up the issue of the ring road again. So this is a couple 3 slides here from that presentation, and that came from the Transportation Commission back in February of 2015. And part of what we looked at was that, well, if we're not going to do a full-blown ring road corridor all the way around the city, what is the alternative? And really what it came down to is, the southwest probably would look pretty much like the southwest was envisioned. The northwest, if anything, would become a highway bypass, pretty straightforward. So we looked primarily at the southeast and the northeast. So this is a map showing the southeast quadrant. The black line represents where the ring road was projected to be. And for the most part, it is off of existing right-of-way. So if you go south of town, there's 3 little silos right there. That's the prime land silos right at the edge of town. Probably familiar with those. We would have come through just immediately south of those silos, come right through what's now the Fountain Industrial Park master plan, or come south and then kicked up here, run along the north side, cross the river, swing and catch Mill Road alignment. This is one of the areas where we did propose to use existing right-of-way fitting between the Parker Farm and the Elks Club golf course. So we had a little bit of a constraint there. Typically the ring road was trying not to use existing right-of-way because the idea was that it would be a very limited access. You're not going to be able to go from your house onto this road. You're not going to be able to go from the local streets to a bunch of local intersections with this road. There would be a few intersections spaced half mile apart, higher speed roadway, 45 mile an hour most likely, possibly higher in the southwest quadrant as a highway route, and very limited access other than maybe some farm access. So we didn't want to displace local roads, such as Palouse River Drive, with the ring road that had limited access, because what do you do with all the businesses that are on Palouse River Drive? Okay, now if the ring road concept falls apart, what's the alternative? Well, we still need to move traffic. We still need to move traffic within the quadrants. So transportation worked on this back in 2015 and said, well, here's an alternative. Let's go ahead and use Palouse River Drive, as far as it goes, and then do some kind of an alignment that swings north on Mill Road. So for the most part, use the existing road right-of-way or corridors. Perhaps they have to get widened, but that would be an alternative to a dedicated minimal access ring road. But along with that, here are some of the caveats, if you will. We would want to implement access control, so still try to limit the number of driveways, not prohibit them, but limit them to what's existing and a few additions here and there where there's no alternative. Possibly reduce the number of driveways in some areas. Reduce the speed from 45 or 50, whatever it would have been, down to 35. And by doing that, we forego what might have been some shorter travel time around the city because now the speeds are down. And there could be some adjustments that we'd have to make within certain areas, like right here. Let's see, where am I? I have to orient myself real quick. Okay, here's Mountain View. Right in here, there's this barely deep hole right next to Frank Bennett's house where the road just drops down and comes back up. We'd have to do something different with the grades to make a higher speed roadway in there work. So that was the thought of Transportation Commission as the alternative to the southeast quadrant for the ring road with those conditions and caveats. Northeast was a little more challenging. This map shows in the kind of magenta purpley color the existing roads that are out there, and if we're going to try to use those, great, but generally they don't connect very well that far out. They wander off and go off to the east, so that doesn't really work. So these were sections, Mountain View, Darby, and Mill, and Robinson Park Road, I guess that is up through there, that we thought, well, okay, here's some routes that are existing we could use, but we'd probably have to connect them in some fashion. So we did identify, okay, tie it here to here, some kind of a route over here, it can wander depending on ownership, topography, et cetera, et cetera. So that became kind of the alternative, and these would really drop to more of a arterial class roadway, like a minor arterial class roadway system, rather than a more of a principal arterial that you might see with a ring road or a highway. And again, some caveats, again, limited or no access type control, again, reduced speed, 30 to 35, depending on what the land use is around it. Again, the shorter travel time is foregone. There are some grade challenges, particularly up here, kind of lots of little ridges that run around up in this area. So that's a challenge to consider, and some additional alignments may be necessary to tie it all together. So that's the work Transportation Commission did somewhat as a result of what was in the multimodal plan, recognizing that, when we're dealing with the county and their land use planning and dealing with our own land use planning and updates to our comprehensive plan, we need to have some idea what the ring road now looks like and how it's going to be categorized. So transportation has done that work. Okay, so back to the plan. Chapter 4, intersection operations. This is, I think, the last section in the Chapter 4 deficiencies portion. It really looks at a multitude of intersections around the city based on the 2035 volume projections and said, okay, where are we going to have problems? Well, here's the list. A lot of these you'd expect where the highways come together, or Steiner intersects the highways on either end, 6 Mountain View, White Avenue, Mountain View, no great surprises, Line Street, A Street, which will be addressed, by the way, in our A Street project in 2019.
Was there any level of service analysis on the 3rd Street and Mountain View intersection if the multimodal bridge was installed?
Again, a limited number of intersections. That one really, as it exists today, didn't have any of that, so the plan didn't address that. So some of the operation recommendations, to improve those situations is reconfigure the A Street and Line Street intersection, which our current design does. It actually makes A Street the through street east-west, so we wouldn't have to stop there. Line Street northbound, as we have it designed, would have a free right to go eastbound. And if you wanted to go left, you'd have to stop and then make a turn. Southbound on Circle Drive goes away. That gets disconnected from the intersection for various reasons. So that would improve the operation of that intersection tremendously. They recommend a roundabout at 6th and Mountain View, which is in our current plan, the grant-funded project for that stretch of Mountain View. And ultimately a signal at State Highway 8 and Mountain View, which we've all anticipated for a while, and extensions of A Street on to the west out towards Warbon. So all things that are generally in our plans and in our overall scope. The plan, Chapter 4, does a couple other components. They do talk about the idea of adopting multimodal design standards, developing a neighborhood traffic management toolbox, which is actually one of the appendices in the document, some access spacing standards, how close together can driveways be, that's a standard that we do not have yet, and then potentially some recommended additional intersection modifications. Okay, long chapter. Chapter 5, active transportation strategy. This is where we get into the bike and pedestrian modes. They recommend that you have a variety of facilities out there. When it comes to biking, this is a dedicated bike lane, actually next to parking in this case. You could have on-street biking. You could have widened lanes that include bikes. You could have dedicated bike lanes. You could have buffered bike lanes. You could have separated paths, et cetera, et cetera. So look at all options to give yourself tools for different situations within the community. Okay, and we've done some of this now. They recommend some education and outreach programs, which are things that we are working on today. They recommend the development of a signage and wayfinding plan. So what you see here on the right is our signing and wayfinding plan. This is just a portion of the overall city, and it shows a portion of the bike routes that are here in green and blue and black, okay, different levels of difficulty. It shows the type of facilities, these little red dots, those are sharrows up and down Main Street in this case. These little railroad track jobs here, these are bike lanes that would be going up 3rd Street by the high school. You'll see those next spring, by the way. And then all these little circle designations represent either destinations, so like this X1 is the downtown core, V1 is the Latah Courthouse, R1 is the high school. So those were identified destinations that people might want to reach on the bicycle network. And then these little guys here, that's like number 2, number, whatever that is, 16, 6, I can't read it. Number 1 there, number 75 up there. Those are locations for signs, for wayfinding signage. So in this particular instance, number 2, this is an intersection of a green route and a black route. At that point, we need signage that says turn right to go here, turn left to go there. So this map has been developed. This is something that Transportation Commission worked on as well. We are in the process of refining the number of destinations on the signs so then we can start manufacturing the signs, and those will start going up next spring. Well, maybe even this winter. So that's in the works. And these came out of this bike facility signage plan, 2016.
That little green line above the 1912 building, that ends right there, though, doesn't it? It has a turn.
This little green guy right here?
Yeah.
No, this is actually part of our Greenway, which is a route that is already signed in terms of the route itself.
Where does it go when it gets
Oh,
off?
it wanders over here and up over in this part of town. It takes it all the way up to north of East City Park, all the way to the north side of the middle school. It now traverses that brand spanking new trail that we just built this summer along the west side of the middle school parking lot. Goes all the way south on Cleveland, clear down to the fairgrounds, and then swings westerly, works its way through that neighborhood, comes out in the area of Lewis Street, crosses the highway, takes you onto Main Street, and then brings you right back to here. That's the Greenway route. And that is in existence today. The sharrows are on the ground. The Greenway route signs are in place and have been since about June. So no, it doesn't stop there and drop off at the edge of the map. Yes, sir.
So wayfinding signs were added in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I was biking around in Fort Collins, and one of the things that was really annoying was the size
Could I
of
just interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
I should have said this before, but when you ask a question, could you please say your name so it goes in the record?
My name's Robert Peckendorf,
And your address?
611 Hathaway Street.
Former Transportation Commission member.
That's true.
Thank you.
Very
It's
nice.
it's just, we're
Yeah,
trying to keep
sounds
track of
good.
minutes.
When I was riding around the city, they have these way signs, but the font is really, really small.
Too small.
And you have to stop and get off. You don't have to actually get off your bike, but you have to get like really close to them, just, because they try to put a bunch of information, 6 different destinations on there.
Too much.
And so you can't, I mean, ideally, you'd like it big enough so you can ride by it, but at least, I think, having that as a consideration, the
It
size
is.
would be really nice.
Yeah, and as I said, we're trying to reduce the number of destinations on the signs because right now, coming out of the transportation plan process or commission process, we ended up with locations where we've got 6 or 7, and it's too many. So we're kind of narrowing that down to get more in the 3 or 4 range. So then you can get bigger text on an appropriately sized sign. So yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. Okay, into trip facilities, something else they're suggesting that if you want to have this great, and I didn't mention this, great walkable, bikeable city, right here at the top, that was how they term it. These are the kind of things that you should do. Into trip facilities are important. So the map on the right is actually a map of a bike parking and bike rack survey that was done through our engineering department. Every one of these little green guys represents where bikes are located. Either they're on a rack or in some cases they're off rack on trees and signs and everything else. So we've done surveys of bike parking in the downtown core. We have information on where we have bike racks. We have now guidelines developed through Transportation Commission on recommended bike rack spacing in the downtown corridor. So we're doing pretty well in terms of all the planning and heading towards implementation, further implementation of bike rack installation. We're missing some in the downtown core that we should have. But the plan also recommends going beyond just bike racks into other types of amenities. On the left, this is a picture I took at University of Washington. This is covered locked bike storage. So you ride your bike there, and of course it rains in Seattle, I hear, in the winter in particular, and so you don't want to have your bike be completely soaked at the end of the day. You rent one of these things, and you put a bike, or maybe 2 or 3 in here, lock it up, and at the end of the day you come home and nobody's messed with it, and you hop on and you ride your back to your apartment or wherever you live. So obviously these kind of things take a big footprint, they have a pretty good cost, but there are other type facilities, whether it's covered bike parking like the university has looked at a little bit. I see Becky's here and she deals with some of those things, or other types of amenities that are other than just parking, but maybe it's repair stations or air stations, pump up your tires, different types of things like that. So that's recommended that we consider end of trip facilities to help promote the use of bicycles as an appropriate alternative mode and encourage people to ride their bike to work or to business and then have facilities that accommodate it. Maintenance policies, take a look at our maintenance policies. Are we sweeping the roads sufficiently? Are we clearing snow sufficiently? Those types of things. And crossings and intersections can be a real detriment to folks, either on foot or on bike. This happens to be near Gritman, just an example out of the plan, where there's a potential conflict there that people have to navigate. One instance that we are real happy about in terms of its current progress is this guy right here. This is the intersection of State Highway 8, Troy Road, and White Avenue, Steiner. Right? Tesoro gas station here, Paradise Creek, right about there, cruising through. Well, right now, this is an intersection that has no control on the highway. It's got stop signs north and south. It's not as wide as it used to be. It used to be just tremendously long to cross. ITD narrowed this a little bit when they rebuilt it in concrete, but it's still kind of a wide open area, and speeds are still up there a little bit, and pedestrians don't feel the most comfortable always running across this roadway. So this is a project that is on the verge of funding through the state. It's been selected. It's just got to get approval from the ITD board, which I think happens early next month, to build an underpass that'll take a trail underneath the highway right alongside the creek and back up to the Paradise Path. So that is in the works as our first major crossing project, if you will, to fix this crossing intersection concern identified in the plan. This is one that Transportation looked at some years ago. Certainly the Paradise Path Task Force looked at it a lot. Now the Paradise Path Commission. Trails Commission? Yeah. So it's we were successful in the grant, and anticipate that would go to construction, I believe, in 18, if I remember right, or 19, but somewhere right in there. So this will be a good thing.
I love this. I would, because I just get killed there, so I go down to Blaine and cross at daylight. What are you going to do? There's cars doing everything right here at this corner. Makes you crazy.
What's not shown on this is the other end of the project, because right now we're picking up the path, going underneath, alongside the creek, coming back up to street grade, and then it continues east on White Avenue, clear over here to the fairgrounds. So that'll be a nice addition all the way down the north side of the street, all the way to the fairgrounds. So we're happy about that one. Signal design and timing, really, when it comes to pedestrian crossing and bikes to a certain extent, what your signals do, it certainly has an impact on the walkability and bikeability of the community. Things like this, which are countdown signal heads, which are now on all of our signals around town. They weren't back then. Help pedestrians understand how much time they have to cross. It's not just the flashlight or not flashing hand. It actually gives you the countdown. Not intended to, but also does provide a little bit of information to the bicyclist who's riding up, and he can watch that countdown, understand when it's going to change, those types of things. But that's beneficial in terms of overall pedestrian safety when they step out into the road. If it's down to 2 seconds, you're not the fastest walker, you just wait. But you don't get caught out in the middle of the intersection that way, right? I have no idea where this picture came from, because these look like little dragon lights up here. I'm not quite sure. Chinatown somewhere. And then sidewalk infill and completion policy is recommended, and we're doing this somewhat informally. We do have a sidewalk program every year. We have a sidewalk policy that was formulated through Transportation Commission, adopted by the council. Talks about how we prioritize. We apply for grants every year. We have city money that goes every year towards sidewalks. This is one of them that we built not too long ago. We've gone through Safe Routes to School program. We're doing ramps through ITD. There's a whole bunch of sidewalk stuff going on. And so we're doing a lot of the things that the plan recommended to infill and to solve problems that are out there. There's a lot to do, but we keep chipping away at it every year. I think we've installed, in the last 10 years, we've probably put in, 300 ADA ramps or some crazy amount. It's just wild. It just keeps growing. Okay, some supporting actions to make all this happen for your walkability is again, the Complete Streets concept. We talked about that a little while ago. Making sure you have a pedestrian network that is being developed and you have a plan for it. We don't have a formal plan yet, but it's coming along. To make sure that you have a bicycle network expansion and improvement plan, which, amazingly enough, here it is, adopted earlier this year, 2016 Bike Route and Facilities Plan. What this shows is the routes and the proposed facilities that would be located on those routes, either sharrows or bike lanes or buffered bike lanes, or in some cases, trails. And there's a lot of information here. You can't really see it all at this scale. But this was adopted by the City Council back in, I believe it was May of this year. So this implementation is underway, a little slow. The fall or the end of the summer caught us a little bit, so we're chipping away at it, but we'll be working at it all through next year and possibly into the next summer now, to put down all of the lane markings, the sharrows, to put up all of the bike route signage, to put up all the wayfinding signage that then goes along with that. So big changes in the biking network within the city of Moscow. So this is what I'm excited about.
Finding sign, do the people that in cities that use these painted like green and red and yellow places for bike to ride, do they not have to have wayfinding signs in? I don't know how those work. I've seen them over in Portland.
There's a lot of different techniques on wayfinding. Some entities or some municipalities in particular use a color coding system. So, for instance, the northeast quadrant of the city is green and the northwest is orange. So as you're doing wayfinding signage, you color code accordingly with those quadrants. We looked at that as a possibility, but our network isn't that large, so we didn't really think it was necessary. So we'll have a pretty standardized sign within the city network, most likely white on green, which is a standard for the biking industry. It'll have a destination, it'll have an arrow, it'll have a mileage, and it'll have a time component. So, it's a mile away, and it should take you, 3 minutes or whatever it is. It can, and it's based on averages, obviously, and it's going to vary. As we go into the university, we're working with the university folks about what the system might look like on the campus and how we can integrate the two systems. The map here shows routes through the campus core, mainly on the street system, well, all on the street system, frankly. And so we just want to make sure that we're consistent as possible in the network, but also true to the university's wayfinding network and signage that they have in place. So we're having those discussions. Access to transit, this is something we've worked on a lot over the years. We built a lot of transit facilities, such as these shelters, but as part of some of the grant funding we've had over the years, it's allowed us to build sidewalks leading to and from transit routes and transit facilities. So that's a good thing. What they're suggesting here is that, it's great to have a transit system, but if you can't get there, particularly on foot or by wheelchair or something like that, it doesn't do you much good. And so making sure that you've got good access corridors to the transit system is pretty vital. Snow removal operations, obviously, we deal with this every winter if it snows. Last year was kind of an exception. Making sure that not only are the streets addressed, but what about the bike routes? What about the pathways? What about sidewalks? And sidewalks are a challenge because snow removal is actually a responsibility of the adjacent property owner. Sometimes they do it, sometimes they don't. We have certain routes that we come in and assist, but for the most part, sidewalk snow removal is by property owner. And then promoting active transportation and recreation. As a city, the more we can promote, the more we can get people to use the system, overall benefits, as we've talked about tonight. One example, and this is that is current. This is a map that is being generated by the Moscow Chamber of Commerce. It is an update to the Peddling the Palouse map. It's been around some time. Transportation Commission has been assisting the Chamber in looking at this map, and this is just a part of it. It's a pretty good size. It shows both the city of Pullman and the city of Moscow systems, plus that's the Chipman Trail in between. It also shows a regional map that goes all the way down to Lewiston and places northeast and west that show some of the more extensive regional routes that aren't necessarily trails, but they're rides that people like to go on that are, the 50K and 100K kind of routes. So it's a great map. Really thrilled to see this coming to fruition. Gina Terusio at the Chamber has been spearheading this, and I think it's going to be a great update to an older map that they produced some years ago. It's nice in that we're incorporating some of our in-town bike facilities like the Greenway will show up on here. and then, other information. So that's part of that public outreach and encouragement, not only for locals, but people coming to the area. Hey, come ride our system. Okay, transit strategy. The chapters will start getting quite a bit shorter here, so we'll pick up the pace. Transit strategy is really just looking at the transit system, kind of stresses the importance of transit. This is one of the little exhibits that talks about, the access, to the business areas and providing good quality service, getting to your homes, allowing higher density if you've got a good bus system, all the community benefits that come with it. They talk about near-term transit service improvements. What could you do in the short term that could make the system better? This is a map that reflects some of that short-term service design recommendations. This is one where they were looking at a third route. If you recall, right now we have an east-west and an east route and a west route. Here you've got a kind of a green west route, a modified bluish east route, and then they kind of add in this yellow route down here, so they kind of split the territory a little bit into 3 potential routes. The long-range version has something even more extensive. I think it has a crosstown express type of thing, and I don't have a map of that today, but those are in the plan. So they were looking at how can service be improved overall. It's something that Transportation Commission should be taking up again here fairly soon, along with the folks from SMART, Jenny Ford, to talk about maybe some potential near-term upgrades. In the long term, they do have charts like this that just talk about some of the kind of amenities that can be constructed over time and, some general costs. This is just part of one table that's in there. There's a bunch of them for different types of amenities that could be constructed. And the concept of supporting the vision. So how do we go out and promote the transit system to make sure the ridership stays up, to answer Nell's question, to make sure the system sticks around in the long haul? Well, there's different ways. They talk about branding, again, multimodal access that we touched on a minute ago, what types of vehicles you use. This is an example of a little flyer from, I think, city of Missoula, where they were promoting one of their activities, bike, walk, and bus week. So get on the bus, use their system. I think their thing, it says healthy transportation, healthy community across there. I think that's part of their branding phrase, healthy transportation, healthy community. So as an example. Okay, Chapter 7. This one's very brief. This has to do with parking and TDM. The chapter's only about 3 or 4 pages long. It really just talks about some management of parking downtown. When this was written, we had just gone through a very extensive downtown parking discussion at the council level and community level, had made some modifications in the overall parking system as it relates to the downtown parking lots, and kind of said, yeah, we think this is good and let's stick with it. So they didn't spend a lot of time on this. They mentioned a little bit some of the travel option programs, not a lot of information here. Didn't really seem like there was a lot that needed to change in the downtown core. Okay, all that leads up to the action manual and what things need to happen, or they think need to happen to make all this work. The manual says, well, there's different processes here. Essentially, they were evaluating what the priorities should be. What do you build first? What provides the best bang for the buck, that type of thing. They have charts like this that talk about the evaluation criteria for, and this happens to be active transportation. So that's the bike ped, there's transit, there's motor vehicle, all of that. They have their own tables. And lo and behold, there they are. There's your 7. Mobility and access, downtown university public spaces, economic resilience, land use, safe streets. I told you they'd come back. So there they are. So they went back to the guiding principles from Chapter 1 and said, okay, let's look at these. And then they broke it down further. So, for instance, the mobility and access right at the top, it then says for the evaluation criteria in the second column, proximity of facility to a transit stop, and closure of a critical gap in the system, and proximity of residents to the proposed facility. So those are the kind of things that are the criteria that are used to assess the priority for each project identified. And it goes on with some descriptions of what all those mean. Okay? So one of these criterion charts was developed for each mode of transportation. It's in the plan. They developed individual modal action plans, so one for bikes, one for pedestrians, one for transit, one for cars. They have sections that look like this, and there's many, many pages of these. This happens to be in the Active Transportation, AT, recommendations number 5 through 7. So they have these little charts that look like this. There's usually a picture that represents the mode, and then a numbered series of recommendations. In this particular case, they're talking about putting in wayfinding signage and encouragement and education programs, and then covered bike parking downtown and other commercial centers. So these are the projects, if you will. Some of them are programs, some of them are construction-related projects or improvements. There's a whole bunch of these in all the different modes. Okay. Funding is touched on. It's, funding's always a question, always a problem. Depends on the mode, depends on what's available, what you're trying to build. So they don't spend a lot of time on it because they don't have a lot of answers, but they do list some alternatives and some options that you could pursue. And then just the general capital improvement plan that comes out of the whole thing that looks sort of like this. And again, this is many pages worth. In this case, we're looking at, I think these are bike lane improvements, BL 14. So they're suggesting Blaine Street should have a bike lane from Indian Hills Drive to Palouse River Drive. Cost estimate is roughly $4,000, which to me is a lot for enough paint. What's the overall rating, in terms of the criteria? Is this a medium, short, long-term kind of a project? Is there funding available, etc. So it's just a part of one of the tables. You can see others. Yeah, look at that, $1.3 million. Ooh. Palouse River Drive, that was part of a bigger road improvement project. So the capital program looks like this throughout the document. They don't really prioritize them in terms of build this one this year or this one over that one. They're really more of the how did they overall rate, and is this a shorter, midterm, long-term kind of program, but really not specific years or time frames per se, because we really didn't know when these would get built, when funding would become available, etc. Some of these things, will happen. Just through like bike lane installations we'll be doing through that program I mentioned a few minutes ago. And this is a map that shows where all those improvements are located. You'll see some of them on the outlying areas. Those look familiar, right? Extensions of roadway systems. You see stuff downtown, improvements on the 3rd Street west of Main. This is interesting little green right downtown. This is a bicycle track on the couplet. That's an interesting one. Separated bike facility. I told him ITD would never buy it. We'll see. Anyway, and then certain spot improvements, kind of in the orange in various places around the community. So just one of the maps that's in the overall plan. That's makes up all of the 8 chapters, and then there are 5 appendices. I'm not going to go through these at all because we've been at this way too long. But these are the individual chapter covers. So that first transportation fact book that has, again, what's in Moscow, what's it all about. The active transportation toolkit, how do you build bicycle and pedestrian facilities. These are the summary reports on the 2 surveys. So the community outreach summary is the online survey that happened for that 3 or 4 months back in 12, and the community transportation survey, that was the, no, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. The community outreach summary here, if I read it, is the actual summary of all the public input process. There we go. I just gave a report on that on Monday, so it's already left my brain. The survey on the right is the summary of the online, and the last one is the survey of the transit onboard process.
Wow. Well, thank you for that.
And maybe more than you wanted, but it's
great.
it's a big plan with lots of detail.
We
and
only
it's-
read till chapter 5.
Yeah.
Well, do you have time for questions?
I certainly do.
Okay, because what I'd like to do is give an opportunity first for commissioners to ask questions. They were supposed to have read the first 5 chapters anyway, and see if anybody has any that we haven't already addressed, and then field some questions from the public or other participating commissioners from other commissions. So, anybody here have a question to ask?
I've got one, less on the east side as you're developing whatever the ring road concept or the connectors. Some of that's outside even the area of city impact, I believe. Would there be some annexation potentially? obviously there'd be a lot of coordination with the county, but how do you see that developing?
The original Ring Road corridor plan was pretty much outside of the area city impact, the ACI. And that was not necessarily intentional, but it was definitely recognized in the development of it. But it was felt that that was necessary to get ahead of the development curve, right? To make sure that we're not impacting something or, developing a plan that suddenly has a subdivision happening on it, next year kind of thing. So, and you have fewer constrictions the further out you go. So that's always been the case. It'd be outside the ACI. If the ACI grows, then it would potentially incorporate some of that road corridor, which would be beneficial to a certain extent. But I say it that way because we work with the county in terms of overall corridor management. They know what our land use plan is. They know what our transportation plan is with respect to the ring road concept, and so they've previously incorporated the concept into their plan for a while, as has the North Latah Highway District, North Latah County Highway District. So that kind of interaction is going on regardless of where the ACI sits. We would not propose to go annex in order to get that corridor within the city. There's really no reason to do that. It's one of those things as things grow and we get there, we make sure that we preserve the corridor where it needs to be preserved. With the change in the overall plan, switching to more on the east side using existing corridor rights of way, then it becomes more of an issue. Okay, is the right of way wide enough, or do you just need to get some additional width for the most part on those existing corridors? So that's an easier endeavor than to say, hey, we're going out across this wheat field and I need 200 feet, cut a swath.
Les, how is the city prioritizing what they want to implement out of this? And then how is planning and zoning, what do we need to be aware of in terms of the implementation?
Let me answer your second question first. I think in terms of planning and zoning, what's probably most beneficial overall is being aware of what's in the plan. Because as you look at land use actions and you look at zoning and comp plan designations, being aware of those routes that are anticipated for extensions or widening of roads or upgrading of roads along the way, I think that's pretty critical. So that the decisions that you make along the way are well informed as it relates to the transportation needs of the city, both today and into the future. We don't want to see development happen in a way that precludes the ability to move traffic from then subsequent development in and out of the community. So I think that's probably the biggest thing from my perspective in terms of planning and zoning, is just being cognizant of the plan and what it entails. As far as prioritization, it really varies quite a bit depending on the mode we're talking about. From the sidewalk perspective, we have tended historically to prioritize the accessibility side of things, so making sure we've got accessible ramps everywhere in the community, and there's lots of places we don't. So when we have money, that's where we tend to look first. We have looked at corridors, and that was something the Mobility Task Force helped us with, identifying corridors where we had gaps, that if we could close this gap, then we've got 16 blocks in a row type of thing where we can get from one side to the other. So we take that into account as part of the sidewalk prioritization process. Limited funds, can only do so much. At times, money becomes available, like the ITD program to build ramps on the highway system. They're funding all of these ramps that we've been building the last 5 years. That comes from them. They're just saying, here's 50,000, 60,000, go build 8 ramps. So they become a higher priority in terms of something else in the system, simply because the money's there. It has to be used there. But we're getting them done, as well as the others that we're working on with their own funding. In other areas, the bike system, I've showed you the plan. That was something we developed over the last year and a half. We have the funding in hand to implement that plan. Some of it's grant money, some of it's city money accumulated over a couple of years. So that will all get done here in the next 18, 24 months. Then the tough one, frankly, is vehicular and transit. Tough too, I guess. Transit is really limited by that outside funding we talked about earlier. You know, federal dollars are what they are, and they've not historically supported a third route or much of an expansion of the system in terms of number of days or number of hours. Maybe that'll change this coming year. We'll see. The vehicular side, freight side, we really are at the mercy of the granting agencies. You know, we apply for every grant we can. You may have heard of the Tiger Grant application that we did this summer. We did very well for a $17 million grant application that would have constructed all of Mountain View Road, almost all of Mountain View Road, from Mountain View Park to State Highway 8. Okay. We made it all the way to the Secretary of Transportation's desk and then got cut. So we made it through 4 rounds, which for a community our size was tremendous. We'll apply again if the opportunity arises. So those kind of opportunities, you know, if they're there, we go after that. We go after state money for grants, other federal dollars where possible. Those tend to drive the priorities in terms of what we're able to build. Because from a city funding perspective, aside from our pavement management program, which this year got $700,000, which is the biggest single year we've had in my time here, we put aside maybe $100,000 to $150,000 in street-related money for capital improvements. That doesn't get you very far. So it takes us, you know, years to accumulate enough money to go build, you know, a piece of Mountain View or a piece of A Street. So yeah, we're really driven priority-wise by where the funding is, where's the money. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That was actually my question.
Super. Sure, I still have, I want to talk about my favorite topic. And what I want to know is, from our comp plan, D and 3rd and 6th are seen as collectors. And now, all of a sudden, on this new plan, 3rd is seen as an arterial. And I would like to know why that change has occurred. Yeah.
Okay. The I guess the last official adopted street classification map was from, I think, went through 2010 timeframe. It had the designations of what's out there essentially today in terms of what's local, what's collector, what's minor collector, and what's principal, or excuse me, collector, minor arterial, and principal arterial. The plan includes recommendations from the consultant on what the classifications should be based on their assessment of the characteristics of the roadway, what it does, or what it should do, depending on its location. Okay. They looked at 3rd Street and said, you know, 3rd Street, particularly if you put in the bridge, would be a route that would carry you from one side of town to another side of town. That typically would fit the definition of a minor arterial versus a collector that tends to serve a more limited area where you're pulling in maybe a couple of neighborhoods and then carrying that traffic to someplace. So that was their recommendation. You know, I can't tell you what exactly was in their mind, but that's what they proposed in the plan. In the city of Moscow, there's not a drastic difference between a collector and a minor arterial. You know, if you're in Seattle, it's a huge difference, right? In the city of Moscow, when you consider for our minor arterials, we might see a volume of 8,000 to 9,000 vehicles a day. A collector may see a volume of, you know, 5,000 to 7,000 vehicles a day. And a local street may see anywhere from, you know, 500 to 3,000 or even more. The distinction between, you know, the 3,000 and 5,000 or 5 to 7, it's not the kind of thing that most people recognize because the volumes aren't that great. Now, if you're in somewhere in like Seattle and you're looking at a collector and it's carrying 10,000 vehicles a day, and you're going to a minor arterial and it's carrying 25,000 vehicles a day, you start to notice the difference. And the principal is maybe 80,000 or 50,000 a day. It's just kind of bizarre. Our principal arterials are the highway system, and they carry 12, 18,000 vehicles a day, something in that range. So our scale is just much smaller. When it comes to how we apply standards between collectors and minor arterials, again, very little difference. It's actually the same street section right now. 2 lanes, bike lanes are appropriate. At the moment, no parking. If parking is desired, then it's an additional width. The right-of-way is different. I believe it's a 70 foot on a minor arterial, or excuse me, on a collector, and 90 feet now in the standard on minor arterials. So if you're creating new extensions of roadway and new right-of-way, in existing road systems, we don't go out there and say, hey, we got to have 70 feet because the standard changed. All right, that's typically not how we approach that. But the street itself looks pretty similar. In terms of speed, we do have some differences in there, and we have a kind of a general rule of thumb that we post local streets at 25, we post collectors at 30, and we post minor arterials at 35. Now, that being said, we have exceptions all over the system. If you go look at D Street as you approach US 95, it's 25 miles an hour. If you go by the schools at the middle school, it's 25 miles an hour, even though it's a higher class street. If you look at our principal arterials downtown, which are state highways, they're 25 miles an hour. So we have a lot of places in town where that rule of thumb isn't necessarily applied, and the reason it's not applied is because the characteristics of the roadway, the neighborhood, congestion, topography, all those kind of things. So we fluctuate that speed based on individual site conditions.
I have a question. Two questions sort of tangential to that, and it has to do with street classification and the figure 4.7 that recommended what they look like. When we deal with new neighborhoods, which there's sort of 2 different conditions, and new subdivisions that are connecting in and having this hierarchical system, we sometimes, well, I would say every time, we run into problems with homeowners who live in adjacent neighborhoods that all of a sudden had a street that all of a sudden becomes a through street that they didn't expect it would be when they bought their property, and so that naturally upsets people in having that through traffic, and especially when they hear the word collector street or arterial. And so how can we better educate people as they purchase properties and become part of a new neighborhood growth area? That would be one question I have when it comes to kind of conflicts between street classification and people's aspirations and how they perceive quality of a neighborhood. And then the other one is, is more directly related to traditional neighborhoods, because the collector, not just 3rd Street, but multiple, B Street or 6th Street, any of them, if you try to really address what the characteristics of that street are supposed to be to qualify, and limited access is one of them. And when you're plowing right through an existing residential area where everything's already been determined for 120 years, that's in natural conflict right there, because it's not. So how do you address that issue without sort of undermining the neighborhood character of something that's, and also how does the grid, which is well connected historically, how does it avoid becoming just a pass-through for all the growth that shows in Chapter 2 that's anticipated on the east side of town? Those are the things that concern me, looking at the whole grid and the whole fabric, and then the development of new neighborhoods and what people's expectations are in terms of connectivity. So it's all about connectivity, I guess. It's sort of all scrambled into one big, mushy question. But
I think I captured your 2 questions in there.
Okay.
How do folks know that roads are going to extend? And that's always a challenge. There seems to be, for some reason, a mindset that if I'm in a house in a subdivision on the edge of town's never going to grow beyond me. And it's always going to be a wheat field, right? And I recall actually being in this room at a hearing, believe it or not, on the Palouse River Drive ball fields some years back, when some neighbors on the north side of Palouse River Drive up on the hill were very upset by the fact that there might be a ball field, and that they thought that that should stay in fields, or out there and stay ag, and they always thought it would be. And a particular council member at the dais said, I used to live in that neighborhood, and I lived north of where you are. And when I lived there, your neighborhood didn't exist. And you wouldn't have a house but for the fact that that field next to me developed into your subdivision, right? One of my greatest, favorite answers of all time up there. But the point was that we are a community that is growing, as do most communities. And so if you're on the edge of town, I guess it seems like it's a little naive to expect that what's beyond you will never change. So how do people hear that? How does that get conveyed? Well, one option is if people come talk to us. They can go online, look at our plans, look at the maps, look at the land use, the projections of growth. All those things are good clues as to the fact that yes, we may very well be changing beyond you. And along with that, the roads have to get extended. So the road that's well, that's
Right at the
yeah.
end of the road where it ends.
temporary end of road, right? 15 years, and then guess what? It extends.
No, seriously.
It's
I don't think it would be such a bad
yeah, well, maybe. I was
Meridian does that.
Meridian does do that. There are cities out there that do that, and I struggle a little bit because I'm in this every day. But I struggle a little with the mindset that here I've got a road that goes to this point at the edge of town, and it just stops. And there isn't a thought that, well, someday it will go on. I have a hard time with that one. But I understand people don't necessarily think about that. And so maybe they're surprised when, guess what? I get a notice that says there's a subdivision, and by the way, the road's going to go through, and maybe it goes around over there and connects to that road, and things change. And they will change. So, yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer to that other than, we can try to be as open as we can about things like this and what we do in our planning, and recognizing that, yes, people may not always know it, try to get the word out as best we can through whatever mechanism we have, that expect that things will grow, things will change, particularly if you're on the edge of town. If you're in the heart of town, it doesn't change so much unless there's an infill project, which surprises people, because that one they may not expect. The neighbor's backyard suddenly has a accessory dwelling unit in it or something like that. Your second question, now I've lost.
Well, my second question was really more about inserting collectors and minor arterials in the traditional
neighborhoods.
Yeah.
We have we have a real challenge in this community when it comes to east-west corridors.
Oh yeah,
right?
absolutely.
We have them, but every single east-west corridor we have, with the exception of State Highway 8, is in a residential neighborhood. And as you say, that's the result of having a grid network that dates back to the origins of the city. And with a few decades of variation in the 70s and 60s, we've pretty well stuck to that grid system. Out of that, there are some that naturally become the easier route, if you will, where people tend to gravitate towards that road. So for us right now, it's 3rd Street, 6th Street D, with B to some extent as you get towards the east end. Those streets are all 30 feet wide. Right? They weren't intended to be high volume type streets when they were contemplated in 1920 and in that era. But that's what we have. So we recognize that, yes, there are impacts associated with putting traffic on those roads. We recognize that those roads do not meet any kind of current standard, and that we generally have no intention of going in and trying to make them meet that standard.
That's good.
All right?
Actually,
So they all have driveways.
Going farther and going with traffic calming all over the place, so that the grid doesn't just become a conduit for eastern growth to get to the west side of town, because that seems to be in all the statistics in the plan,
and that's an
the
option.
destination of everybody.
Yeah, and that's an option, but part of what you think about is when you do traffic calming, there's a tendency to then move people elsewhere. If every single corridor, major route, 3rd, 6D, has traffic calming, people are going to start saying, this is slow, I'm going to go take 1st. And then jog my way around at various points. So then you start spreading more of the traffic into those truly local roads, right? So this is something transportation struggled with about 18 years ago. Do we do flood irrigation, where we want people on every street going east-west, or do we do some kind of canal system, channelized a little bit more, so that those routes, 3rd, 6th, D, carry more of the traffic? Obviously, there's more burden for the adjacent properties because they're seeing more volume, okay? But, in the overall network scheme, things work a little better, flow a little better, and there's a little more predictability. So, it's a challenge.
In Maine, pretty much anyway, right?
Well,
Except for D Street.
Downtown's our bottleneck, right? I mean, even D, you hit Maine and you come south, and guess what? You come to 3rd Street, right? It's
Well, do you get around on A and
You could.
yeah, because it seems like most traffic is westbound. I mean, in higher.
You ever drive in North Spokane? Ever go to Ash Street, Maple?
Oh.
Yeah. Those are residential neighborhoods that have, high-speed 2-lane roadways on them, and that's something I never want to see in this community. But it is something that they've had to deal with. It's short of going out and buying out a bunch of houses, and obviously that's not something we would ever contemplate. But it's a challenge.
Other questions from here?
Did the one last question, traffic calming device at the middle school, was that spring out of this study, or did that come from internal point of view?
That is not identified specifically in the study. It did talk about some sidewalk pathway improvements near the middle school. Probably the first origin was through a U of I student project that assessed the overall traffic flow and parking and pedestrian condition around the middle school. And they did it as one of their design classes and came up with an idea, which came to us. It's something we'd been thinking about as well, but they were the first one to kind of put it all on paper. And then ultimately we said, okay, this is probably a good idea. Talk to the school district. We'd known that there were issues there for years with the crosswalks. If you remember coming out of Egan, there was this weird diagonal that went like 50 feet down the street before you got across. It's crazy. So we want to fix those kind of things. And then the parking lot on the east side of the high school or the middle school backed out onto D Street. And so you got backing movements, you got pedestrians everywhere, you got through traffic. It's just a mess. So we'd been looking at it for a while, and then we had an opportunity through the Community Choices Grant program to apply for some funding with the school district to build the street, put in the traffic calming, fix the configuration of their parking lot, get the trail in, it's part of the Greenway on the west side, and then the school district on their own funded all that parking lot improvement on the west side of the building to reconstruct that, move the buses off of D Street up to the north side by the admin building, just do that whole thing. So it really kind of morphed out of a staff and student collaboration, if you will.
So again, that's kind of that compromise between, I forget, that's an minor arterial, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's that compromise between what a minor arterial is supposed to be on paper and what the community need and quality needs to be. I think it's a minor arterial. And something that's,
I don't recall.
East City Park could easily have something of that kind of quality, I was thinking, and that's why I was just trying to see where the idea came from, because as the functions that go on in the park and with the number of both children and dog lovers seem to be growing by the week. And
yeah, the concept of
creating something on East City Park that would make a statement about, the university. I think the university's efforts on Deacon and on 6th have been fairly successful.
Yeah.
It certainly gets me to slow down nicely, and I would think that something like that at East City Park would be a real amenity.
Yeah, what we would be looking at is the entire 3rd Street corridor, really from the high school on out to Mountain View, and the types of
Coming in long before the bridge is built.
it's a money.
Is that a thought?
It's a money question. It is a thought, actually. We've actually contemplated that previously, but it's always a money question and timing. But the 3rd Street corridor varies a lot in size. And so the types of treatments would have to vary. So when you're in the 30-foot section, you can't really do curb bulbs and narrowing because there's nowhere to narrow, right? If you get east of Blaine, when you get into the 44-foot section out there, that type of a treatment that's on D Street could very easily be applied out in that area because you've got the width to work with. When you come back along East City Park, it's probably going to be other types of treatments, perhaps. Could be some raised platforms like there on campus, rather than the horizontal. It's more a little bit of a vertical, and there's some other possibilities. We are looking to add bike lanes going up the hill here by the high school to get to the top of the hill, and then sharrows after that. So there'll be some signage and various things that go. Those kind of things also tend to help a little bit because now you got bikes in the mix and people become aware of them. So it also helps a little bit speed. So yeah, it's a corridor that we'd have to ultimately figure out what that traffic calming would be. But yeah, there's some different options in different sections.
Well, we could go to the general audience if anybody has some questions that haven't been addressed. Could you state your name, please?
When you Becker Gooch, 234 South Roseville. I was wondering on that same note of the traffic calming, desperate is needed from high school. That is really a real, almost dangerous for the students. I see cars and students dodging each other all the time over there.
Yeah, it's an interesting locale because there's a lot of traffic, pedestrian traffic and buses in the mix, and then the cars and the bikes that are zipping down the hill, and quite a mix of things. Police does pretty consistent enforcement in that corridor because of the 15-mile-an-hour speed limit. And if people are truly driving it, then that lower speed tends to help the safety perspective. Could there be some other treatments in there? I think there could. We'd have to figure out what works with parking and bike lanes and vehicular lanes because you've got competing interests, right? But possibly some curb bulbs at intersections that cut the sidewalk or the crosswalk links down, but still allow the 2 lanes and the bike lane going uphill, and then parking, outside of those areas. So yeah, I think there's potential. That would be part of looking at that entire corridor.
Yes.
Going back to street classification, Joanne Minita, 203 South Howard. I think, according to the plan, Chapter 2, page 29, streets classified as arterials are intended to move large volumes of traffic through and within the city. These streets have higher speeds, more lanes, and fewer stops. So it would, just to say, well, we don't really mean it's an arterial, but that's what we classify it. I don't think that's good planning. I think if you don't mean it to be an arterial, you should go back to calling it a collector. If you mean it to be an arterial, that's a big discussion. You're going to have higher speeds, more lanes, fewer stops.
Perhaps. Yeah. We have very few minor arterials that are multi-lane. Just the size of the system just doesn't really warrant it. So yeah, it's like I say, in a bigger community, the distinction between classes is much greater. Like you say, multi-lanes, higher speeds, access control, those kind of things on minor arterials, much more common in a bigger community. We have a system that has the gradation, but it's much compressed. So, yeah, could they all be collectors? I suppose you could. In terms of overall funding, when applying for grants, it doesn't matter. Either one is eligible. In terms of speed, as I've said, we try to be cognizant of what's going on along the corridor when we set speeds and the characteristics of the roadway itself, because that's part of what we have to do. So, we have the variation in speed, and really that happens anywhere. I mean, if you go to Ada County and you go on their big network out there, some places it's a 5-lane roadway and it's 50 miles an hour, 45 miles an hour. I'm looking at Walter because he's down there a lot.
Eagle Road is 55 miles an hour.
But in other areas, it's somewhere less than that, right? It drops down. Look at, for us, State Highway 8, Pullman Road. As you're heading out of town, you're on 3rd Street, it's 2 lanes, it's 25 miles an hour. You hit the little S-curve where it transitions before you hit line, it jumps to 35. You get halfway down the frontage of the mall and it goes to 45. So between Line Street and the state line, what's changed? Really not much of anything, but the speeds have picked up. And that is because the highway department's saying, hey, we're ramping our way up on their way out of town. Could the 45 come down someday if the volumes get high enough and congestion happens? Certainly. But my point is that as a corridor, that's a primary or principal arterial, the entire length, and it goes from 25 to 45 within city limits. So just because it has the classification doesn't mean it has a set speed or size or characteristic. You're generally classifying how the road functions.
That's the point. Is it going to function as high
speed, high volume?
large traffic or not? I could say something going the other way. It would be better to keep it lower because that's where you're having all the accidents. And if you keep changing the speed limit, people get confused and the pedestrians don't know when they can cross or not. But that's another subject. But I just think that if the intent is to have high volume transportation, then we need to know it. If it's not, it should be a collector.
Well, and part of it's a question of intent and part of it's a question of what happens. So right now, 3rd Street, 6th Street, and D Street carry, with the exception of the highway, which is a principal arterial, they carry the highest volume traffic east-west in town. So, and they serve in a way that, with the exception of 3rd now, on the east end, they serve in a way that they carry traffic from one side of town to the other side of town. Does that fit the classification of a collector or the classification of a minor arterial? Well, obviously the plan had some recommendations, and the council in the past has passed, some classification maps. Yeah, which do you call it, and what does it mean? For me, in the long run, for a community this size with the kind of volumes we have, I'm not sure it makes a lot of difference in terms of what actually happens on the ground, because we do have the flexibility in how we build it, how we post it, how we treat it. Okay.
Speculating on that, then maybe that shouldn't be in the multimodal plan, that description of what that street is.
It was the recommendation based upon their study of the system.
But the description is exactly what you said you weren't going to do as far as the high speed and high traffic.
Well, in general, as I said earlier, the rule of thumb on minor arterials is 35, but there are exceptions. So that's the case in any system you go to across the country. You may have minor arterials that vary in speed. And is it always high speed? No. In our community, 35 is pretty high speed, right? Yeah, but if you're in Spokane, that's not the case. And so, again, the scale of the system is down. It's a classification system that's used across the country. It's been kind of fit into our much condensed system.
Well, it's not so much the classification as the plan calls for it to be high speed. I mean, it identifies the arterial as being high speed, no stops.
As the typical characteristics. It doesn't mean you have to do it that way. It's the typical characteristics of those classes.
Walter, you have a question?
Walter State City Council. I was an original charter member of the Transportation Commission in 1998. Served 5 years and was chair for 4 years before I went to council. In the first half dozen meetings of the Transportation Commission, we identified east-west, lack of east-west connectivity as the biggest problem with transportation in Moscow. We went through all other things after that. We did downtown parking for a year, we did sidewalks for a year, we did buses for a year. But then if you think about it, and a lot of you have been around here longer than I have even, we've lost things with east-west. When they put the one-way system in to downtown Moscow in 95, we ultimately lost A Street as a real crosstown street. When the city council, because they were asked by residents to put stop signs on First Street to slow the traffic down, we lost First Street. the traffic moves to where they can get somewhere. We had a saying in transportation that the Moscow drivers were gerbils. We meant it with all the affection in the world. My wife was one of the best, and I could find her going up alleys because they wanted to keep moving, and they found that they could get ahead of that red car they were behind every day they were commuting. If they went this way, they'd find it, behind them. So to
Well,
look
we
at,
don't have a distributed grid though, we have.
but we don't. So
And-
we're trying to look at what we do have that can be made available to move some of this traffic around on the small number of streets we've got that go from one side to the other, almost one side to the other. Let's talk about the question of flood versus canal. We looked at the flood, and it just doesn't work because people then say, I've got too many cars going too fast in front of my house, I need a stop sign on the corner. Well, that kind of stops that, and people move over to Nels's Street, or move over to somebody else's street. They shuffle all over the place.
Unless you do them all. That's what they
Yeah.
started to do in Seattle with traffic calming on the grid. Every single neighborhood, little street has traffic calming on it now, so that people, if they want to cut through, they can do it, but they're going to slow down.
But
But they have more money, maybe.
the reason they can do that is because they have higher class, high volume, high speed streets. And what they're trying to do is keep people on those corridors instead of using the neighborhood. For us, 3rd, 6th, D. That's it. Those are our higher corridors. I mean, that's what we got.
Well, and truth be told, drivers in Moscow are pretty respective of the speed limits. I mean, they truly are. I know a car going past the front of your house looks like it's doing 80 miles an hour. I'll give you that. But in reality, it probably isn't. They put the radar trailer out virtually 5 days a week, 7 days a week. When people make a phone call, you can get that radar trailer on your street to tell your neighbors, this is the speed limit, it's 30 miles an hour, and you're getting to 27, and that's too fast. And Les looks at this stuff. His traffic counters don't just count cars, they count speed as well. And they can tell what the fact that at one point something was doing 50. Was it a teenager or an ambulance? I don't know the answer. But the rest of them were down in this bracket of speed. So we do work at it. The citizens are very, very good at not really blowing past what the speed limits are. Because I drive it like y'all do, and I look down and I'm either 3 or 4 miles an hour under the limit, and nobody's really pushing me. We're all just moving along, getting to where we're going. But we're all looking for the better way to go. Another street, another alley, they'll get us
Well,
there.
that's why pushing the other aspects of the plan, the multimodal plan, will help some of that, and make us all healthier, right? Well, we didn't really intend this to be a referendum on the plan. It's already gone through its public process, and it's been adopted, and we really appreciate you coming and explaining it to us because it helps us understand it better and to guide us as we make land use decisions, when people come with proposals and we have public hearings, et cetera. So I think it's been, for me, I know, really helpful. I hope the rest of you would agree, and we really appreciate you taking all the time to do this. And it's been 2.5 hours.
Feet are getting tired.
Wednesday night. So,
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Liz.
I suggest at least a reset, that sort of maybe engulfs our shared readings discussion.
I think so.
Yeah, because we were supposed to be prepared. But I suggest we're going to move on to this table that we take up maybe 5-minute break, is that right?
Well, it was just more of a reminder.
Oh, okay.
Les's presentation was going to take up the majority of the time, but I think I had given you some homework last time. And to review, got a new use table, and then where we had started from, that kind of goes through our thought process on that. And we won't talk about it tonight, but we'll bring it up from the December meeting. We'll go through maybe all of your questions about the uses.
Oh, yeah.
Anything that you have.
Everything you said to me.
Okay, yeah, we have a lot of reading materials that we can have for this.
And I think, Diane sent out the Excel table in that format, so if you have any questions, feel free to email me.
Yeah, she knows.
Was there last, she sent it out, yeah, right after.
Yeah.
Speaking of somebody who's up to 3 last night, thanks for the reminder.
To me, that makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. And it's cost saving to the driver. You don't have to like $200. But it just seems like a no-brainer to me.
I've scribbled them.
So we only have 8 members. So everybody's here.